So, for some reason, a lot of Tolkien fans have been really raging on George R. R. Martin. And let me just and I will make a distinction between Tolkien Twitter fans and the subreddit fans, because there is a very big difference. But for some reason, this popped up. Now, for those of you who don't know, George R. R. Martin, of course, draws references and inspiration from Tolkien. Everybody fucking does at this point.
Sure.
And, of course, George is a fan of Lord of the Rings and all that. However, this Twitter post, I sent you the Twitter post here on Discord, this Twitter post from the Chivalry Guide really just hit traction. 4.6 million views on Twitter. Of course, because he's paying for Twitter Blue, the algorithm really helped that. But I have the quote here. It's the George quote that we've referenced multiple times before. George R. R. Martin talking about Aragorn's tax policy and shit like that. Apparently this guy, Chivalry Guide, I guess he just discovered this or something, but he tweets out here, imagine thinking you scored a point on Tolkien by claiming he didn't pay enough attention to tax policy. This guy goes on to say, a few replies are posting, but you're missing the point. He's not actually trying to score points. To which this guy goes, when you offer the work of others and suggest that your own is more sophisticated, you are trying to score points. See, I don't think that's what George was trying to do. And we've discussed this privately before. I think the mark of a super fan, and you would know, you're an Ice and Fire super fan, the mark of a super fan is wanting to know those intricate, often boring details of tax policies. Like, for example, Maegor the Cruel, one of the Targaryen kings, Maegor the Cruel, could not have a child for the life of him. And you're such a super fan, you're like, I wonder why that is. And you went into, like, researching as to what are the reasons it could be. And what's the reason you came up with? Why Maegor, he had, like, two white chromosomes?
Oh, yeah, that he was perhaps double X, 2XXY. He was XXY was like my idea. But people that are XXY are sterile, so I don't know if he actually like produced.
No, but here's the thing though. You dived into that. You're a super fan. You want to know like the intricate details as to why this is, what's happening here. Instead of just taking the story as is and then going to bed, you stay up late at night fucking researching this. That's the mark of a super fan. The fact that George was able to ask these questions means that he clearly loved the material and wanted to know more, which inspired him to do his own story.
Yeah, I mean George has a love-hate relationship with Tolkien. I mean he loves Tolkien, but he also like has some very serious criticisms of Tolkien. Which is fine. I mean, George's work is later, so I think that by having the benefit of being later, work is often more sophisticated because you're now analyzing things on another level past, so there's a lot of strengths that George R. R. Martin has over Tolkien. Like George writes better dialogue, he writes better prose, it's easier to read, it flows better. Tolkien spent more time creating a consistent universe and creating the world building behind with regards to, especially, I mean, everybody brings up the language aspects and things like that. But I don't know. I mean, it's different kind of work, but
bro, it's pages. Say what you will about George. Tolkien's pages of like songs and shit. I think I would take songs over like descriptions of food, but that's just me.
Yeah, I mean they both have their weaknesses and they both have their strengths. They're very different writers. They're very different writers. Tolkien was I mean, it's not that Tolkien didn't like take from other fantasy before. He did, but there's a lot of imagination in creating this new environment.
I disagree with you. Well, maybe it's not fair to me to disagree with you since you're like a George R. R. Martin expert as well. But George R. R. Martin's criticism of Tolkien is, I wouldn't say it's a love-hate from what I can see here, because there's another quote I've actually never seen before. I don't know if you have either. I'll dish it out in a minute, but
sure.
George's criticism of Tolkien here is so George R. R. Martin. Like, it's like you can't even take this seriously. So the quote here that George said about Tolkien is, life is very full of sex, or should be. As much as I admire Tolkien, and I do, he was a giant of fantasy and a giant of literature, and I think he wrote a great book that will be read for many years. you do have to wonder where all those hobbits came from, since you can't imagine hobbits having sex, can you? Well, sex is an important part of who we are. It drives us, it motivates us, it makes us do sometimes very noble things, and it makes us do sometimes incredibly stupid things. Leave it out, and you've got an incomplete world. That's such a George thing to say. Like,
I mean, I agree with it 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say it's the big criticism of Star Wars too.
Yeah.
It's a very sexless, sterile world. But yeah. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, you know, what George is putting into the story, he's trying to put all the emotion and what's the primary causer of emotion is you know, romantic turmoil, you know. So no, I mean, I agree with him, you know, and Tolkien doesn't have as much of it, you know. Why, you know, think of it this way, like the Fellowship of the Rings is a bunch of bros like walking through the woods for months. Have you ever been on a camping trip with guys?
No, I have not.
Well, I mean, or spent just any amount of time with only men. Think about how fucking vulgar it gets. You know, I'm talking you playing video games, you know, like shouldn't they just be talking sex like the entire time?
You would think, right? That's a good point. You would think, right?
You know, right? You know, like people making comments about whatever, dwarf pussy, hobbit pussy, like shouldn't they be talking about that stuff? You know,
I mean, they were probably talking about they were probably talking about it in a very Tolkien-esque way, you know. But I have to point this out because the fandom of the fandom on Twitter versus fandom everywhere else is so fucking crazy. This one person in that Twitter thread, he says, "I'm convinced Martin is a sexual deviant obsessed with rape because he loves to write about that. His legacy is a movie series, His legacy is a movie series that you can't watch in public because of all the skin they have to lure an audience with. Tolkien is far, far more eternal than Martin." First off, a movie, my man, you've never even... Okay.
Society is pretty fucked up if you're sitting there being like, oh, I can't like show Tolkien because there's too much skin. I mean, I'm sorry, I can't show Martin because there's too much skin. Like, how much violence is there in Tolkien, in say the Lord of the Rings movies? You know, like how many people are getting their heads cut off? How much blood is getting spurted out? It's happened constantly. You know, like why is that okay? Why is that okay for children? Why is that okay for children to see versus like, you know?
Because they're monsters.
But it's still like death. It's still gore. Why do people think it's okay to show violence to children, but it's not okay to show sex?
That's a good point.
You know, so I'm saying like this person is just like got a weird puritanical like backwards view about sex. Like, 100%. You know, let's just you know, step back. It's just sex.
But
you know?
and let me make this very clear. Like I clearly not all Tolkien fans are like this. It's just like the ones on this Twitter thread.
Sure.
You go over. I'm browsing through Reddit and the same shit pops up on the Lord of the Rings subreddit. And you just look at the comments. These guys are not taking the bait. Shout out to the Lord of the Rings subreddits. They were not taking the bait. They were like, "Look, can we ban these types of like baity posts to like try to get us to hate on George?" Sure. So shout out to those guys. Like those guys are fucking very mature.
I'm sure they see this shit like every day. So, yeah.
I was watching this YouTube video on this same fucking topic, and I'm not gonna call out the YouTuber because smaller channel, and I feel like if I do, like people are gonna go, "Why are you bullying small?" But one guy was trying to say how, I want to say his name so badly, but I won't. One guy was trying to say how in like the first 2 minutes of his video, yeah, the only reason Martin is saying this is because he's trying to gain clout. He's trying to gain clout, and it's intellectually dishonest. I'm like, George R.R. Martin, this 80, how old is he? 1,000? Like, how old is he? He's trying to get clout.
He's 75.
75-year-old man trying to get clout on. Really?
I don't think George R. Martin would know what clout is. Like he's literally, keep in mind, he's literally a boomer. He is.
Oh God,
like he's literally a boomer. Okay, like you can't be like, oh yeah, he's trying to get clout. Oh really? Is there anything else? Do you think he's like, You think, like this guy, he doesn't know how to use Twitter. He doesn't know about these sorts of things. Okay. He uses WordStar to write his books. Like, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, oh man.
We also need to be transparent, because I know people are going to say, well, of course you guys are going to defend George. You guys are ice and fight. Here's the thing. This is something you and I have both said before. You specifically. George has said that he thinks that Jaime Lannister could defeat Aragorn. No, he couldn't. Jaime Lannister, I don't think Jaime could defeat Aragorn at all. No way. And George has said that.
Isn't Aragorn like much older?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So he's just much more trained, right? I mean,
Yeah,
Aragorn should, of course, like win. He's got like 50 years. Like, Aragorn's like unusually old, right? He's like 75.
Something like that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I mean,
also,
yeah.
Tolkien fans, I'm going to say this to you guys right now. What do you guys even like, and I say this to the chivalry guy too, like, what are you guys even complaining about? Your god finished his story. Like, anytime any, like, first off, Game of Thrones fans have no business bitching about anything Lord of the Rings. Because the moment we do, all you guys have to do is, well, at least he finished his shit.
Right.
That's true.
You always, they'll always have that. They always have that trump card.
It's like it actually is a trump card. It really fucking is. At least Tolkien fans, at least he had kids to, like, continue the legacy to make sure nobody fucks with it. Like,
Right.
It's true. So, Tolkien fans, calm down. To the ones that are crazy, calm down. You have no reason to fret. Let George be George, and his criticisms are very George R.R. Martin-esque. They're not to be taken that seriously. And
no, but I would say that the primary criticism, where you're talking about Aragorn's tax policy, and the Aragorn tax policy quote, and he repeats that same one. He said the Aragorn tax policy quote like a few times, but it's not specifically about Aragorn's tax policy. It's how really did Aragorn solve all the problems at the end? Because when you really step back and go, wait a minute. What happened to all the orcs? Like, were all of the orcs like killed in war? And this is the big question when you say, like, what happened to the orcs? Now you could say, well, they were all slaughtered, or maybe they just weren't allowed to breed anymore, or whatever. But you're talking about whatever it is, like Aragorn and his successors like participated in literal genocide. Like, there was a holocaust of orcs. That's the only way you can logically like go from there. And you can kind of, people go, well, it doesn't matter because, orcs are all evil and stuff like this. And, so it doesn't matter because as long as they're bad people, we can just, it's okay that they all get wiped out.
If I recall correctly, what happened at the very end is that a lot of them lost their minds and went crazy, or just like went away, and most of them were not seen again unless it was like very, very rare. Because remember, there's a difference. This is something a lot of Lord of the Rings fans love to point out. There is a difference between the way Tolkien wrote the orcs versus how Peter Jackson portrayed them. Peter Jackson portrayed them as monsters that, if were left unchecked, would come out and fuck you up. Whereas I feel like in the Lord of the Rings books, they're more like mischievous little like goblin, and they feel more harmless.
Right, but this is this weird moral question. So all of a sudden, like, if orcs are wholly evil, meaning you can kill them without any sort of regret or feeling bad. What does that say about your narrative and what sort of message you're trying to say? Like, how does this relate now to the real world? Who are the orcs? And like, I mean, and this is I think a very, very important question. I would say the primary criticism that I have with Tolkien and what George is trying to say when he says Aragorn's tax policy. What he's talking about is like the logistics of really how did he bring peace at the end of that story? And the answer is he just killed all the problem makers, or the problem makers died, And that's a pretty fucked up, like, one, it's a pretty fucked up thing. And yeah, Tolkien wasn't really thinking about it, but it's like, when you step back and say, like, well, what kind of statement are you making about the world with that presentation of how armies and humanity and societies clash? And like, once you step back and go, oh, actually Tolkien's whole setup was fundamentally flawed. And it was. And I love Tolkien, but I will say his entire, like, everybody's like, oh, you're such a great world builder. He built his world wrong. Fundamentally, he built his world wrong. He had, he created, it's a story that, is part of it is this like struggle against a different civilization and a different way of doing things. And in the end, that civilization is just those people are all killed. Like, they're all killed. They all are guilty of Sauron. Like, Sauron, they are as guilty as Sauron, and they just every single soldier, and they just all died.
They were bred specifically to be cruel, hateful monsters. So it's like really tough to get these things back into
how
society.
often do you hear that argument about peoples on this world? Because I hear that argument on peoples on this world all the time. Like, oh, they teach them in their society from a young age. They teach us to hate us. How often? After 9/11, how often do we hear about like the madrasas that are in Pakistan and Afghanistan teaching kids how to hate us? How often do you hear that? And about like children in Gaza, right? They're being bred that way. So. And I won't say this is just like important moral questions. This is the important moral question. Right? This is the big thing. And so I will defend George and George is being tactful when he says what's Aragorn's tax policy, because what he really means to say is what's Aragorn's Holocaust policy. That's what he means to say. Because really saving the world is a messy, complicated, difficult thing. Much more difficult than tossing a goddamn ring into a volcano.
Mm-hmm.
And having your forgotten king suddenly appear and have everybody go, oh yeah, king, boom, and kneel, right? It's a lot harder to fix the world than that.
By the way, people keep forgetting this because once again, the movies don't outright specifically state it. So remember, the first time that Sauron was defeated in the War of the Last Alliance, the first time he was defeated, Isildur was supposed to destroy the ring, but didn't. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Many years later, as Isildur is riding through a forest, he was ambushed by orcs, still under like Sauron's orders or guidance or whatever. And the orcs are the ones that, like, in hiding in that forest, laid ambush to him, were the one that killed him in the end. So the argument to actually hunt these things down, because look what happened. Even after Sauron was defeated, there it is. It's a decent argument that orcs could still be a threat to people because they were bred for, specifically bred with cruelty, using magic, for cruelty and whatnot. But over here, we do have a definitive thing for it. This is from the book. So the creatures of Sauron, orc or troll, or beast spell enslaved, ran hither and thither mindless, and some slew themselves or cast themselves in pits, or fled, willing back to hide in holes and dark lightless places, far from hope.
But what I'm saying is beyond that, is even if you're saying like, oh, the orcs are all evil in the story, how does a world that has completely evil people in it relate to our world? Like where like the reason we read fiction is for the allegory. Like that's like a major part. Like, what moral questions can we possibly derive from a tale that includes completely evil people? Like, what lesson are you learning in the end? That there are completely evil people in the world and they deserve to be killed? The lack of nuance to the orc, that the lack of nuance to Sauron's cause, that it's just evil. Oh, well, what is good and evil? Well, I mean, and this is why, in the tale there's a god and a devil and all these things in Lord of the Rings. There's Uvatar and Morgoth and all this. So it's not a modern practical like human tale. Now it's still in other ways like subverts things by having the hobbits be the by the main characters and things like that, and it obviously has so much detail and many things are very beautifully written and people love it. But George is pointing out something that's very quite legit, and he's being tactful by saying what's Aragorn's tax policy. Yeah, and he's not doing it for clout. He's not doing it for fucking clout. Holy shit.
That YouTuber, dude. Like, I wish I could call that kid out, but he's got less than 1,000 subs. I'm gonna be an asshole if I do. People are gonna accuse me of bullying and shit. So.
Or he'll get 20,000 more subs. But whatever the case, it's yeah. I don't think there's much defense of it in this modern time. I mean, granted, like Tolkien was writing at a different time, but and I know that after Lord of the Rings was written, like people did ask Tolkien like this question a lot, and he had to like write on it. Like, are all the orcs evil? Like, this actually bothered people. Like, and it bothered people like when Tolkien lived, and that he like thought about it and dwelled on it and tried to come up with good answers to it, which is kind of funny,
They're asking him questions like that instead about, what about the Eagles? That's the one that